And welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on YouTube and Pacifica Radio and on Progressive Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and more. And it's also available, the complete archives, at opednews.com/podcasts with an S. So my guest for this show is Michael Ventrella. He is an appellate and criminal defense attorney who has taught constitutional law at a number of colleges in the Philadelphia and Boston areas. And he has a book, How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative. So, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, what's the story with this book?
Too many people just don't understand what the Constitution is, and they constantly argue it, and they don't know what they're talking about. And I thought it'd be good to find a way to explain that to people, both liberals and conservatives, in a funny way that made it interesting to read and not read like a textbook. So it's humorous, a way to learn about the basic arguments that come up with the Constitution, but it's not meant to be a textbook in any way. It's meant to be a fun read. But even if you read this, you'll know more than 99% of most Americans, including some presidents I could name.
So if you get your dream and people read it, what are the most important things that you want them to take away from reading this book?
I think people need to understand that the Constitution is not some document written on tablets that was handed down from the founding father gods, but it's a political document written by politicians, interpreted by judges who are politicians. And so therefore you have to understand that the Constitution is interpreted by everybody, conservatives and liberals, and it's subject to change as society changes. It's those people who say there's one founding father ideal and we have to do what the founding fathers wanted, that I'm trying to break that idea of the founding fathers. We should forget what the founding fathers wanted, because even they didn't agree. Obviously this wasn't passed unanimously. So mostly I want to break that concept that somehow this is our Bible. Too many people look at it and think that there's only one interpretation, and it's always their interpretation.
And you talk about how there are Constitution fundamentalists just like there are Bible fundamentalists.
Yes, that's the term I use for people who read it and think that there's only one interpretation of it, just like Christian fundamentalists tend to be. And of course, it always matches their own viewpoint perfectly and exactly. Isn't that amazing?
And you referred to one example in the book.
Which one are you referring to specifically?
I think Scalia, right?
Oh, yeah. Justice Scalia was terrible about that. He believed that he had some sort of supernatural power in order to figure out what the founders wanted, or what the founders knew about internet regulations or something. And the problem with him and those kind of fundamentalists is that they don't understand that even the founding fathers argued over these things. Within years of the Constitution's writing, they were in court arguing it, founding fathers arguing against founding fathers about the meaning. So for us to sit back and say, oh, there's one meaning, is just ridiculous. That's not how it works. Okay. Basically it's whatever judges say it is, and that's why it's so important that we get good judges.
And what's the message that you want to give to a conservative then?
It depends on what kind of conservative you're talking about. If you're talking about a Trump kind of conservative, it doesn't matter what I say, because no facts seem to affect those people. Logic and facts just go over their heads. But I'm talking about logical, realistic conservatives. There are some out there. I have some friends who are that way. They generally don't call themselves Republicans anymore, but they will listen to facts and argue with you. And this is something that I think your Trump-loving father is not going to like this for a Christmas present, but a logical libertarian type of conservative might go into it and enjoy the book.
But wait, I'm thinking, when it comes, when you talk about compromise, you say that radical libertarians are the worst.
Radical libertarians are the worst. Absolutely. Radical libertarians are as bad as the Trump fundamentalists, because radical libertarians are like, all government is bad, except of course the government they like, when it serves them personally, then of course they love it. But radical libertarians are terrible. You can't argue with them either. But there are some reasonable ones, just like, there are radical liberals who you can't argue with either, So if you're too extreme on one end or the other, sometimes it's not going to lead you to get anything accomplished.
And you're saying that the Constitution is a political document.
Absolutely. It was written by politicians. It's been interpreted by politicians. Um, there are so many compromises in the Constitution in order to get it passed. It's not like it was written down and everyone said, this is great. They argued about it constantly. Things got knocked out, things got changed, words got changed. That's what politics is. So if you look at all law is politics, including the Constitution, I think you understand law better that way.
And you co-authored this book with an illustrator. For the video, I'm gonna put the picture up there. It's a picture of Frankenstein. I don't know if you can see it.
Yep, there you go.
Picture of Frankenstein, and it's got religious freedom and freedom of speech, and money equals speech, and 14th Amendment protection, and corporate personhood, and all these are different parts pieced together to make the Frankenstein monster.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider the Constitution a monster?
I think in this particular case, his cartoon was about corporate personhood more than anything else. We created the idea, the conservatives on the court created the idea that corporations are people, right? You've heard politicians say that. And how did they do that? Well, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that. There's no way the founding fathers would have said that. So what the courts did is they pieced together all these things to make corporate personhood in the Constitution. Money is speech is another thing that's not in the Constitution that the conservatives made up. And so what happens is, I don't think that cartoon is saying that the Constitution is a Frankenstein monster. I think it's saying corporate personhood is a Frankenstein monster.
I was looking, if you're wondering, I have a copy. There are a couple books that have written about how corporate personhood was snuck into.
Yes.
It's not really the Constitution. It's Supreme Court decisions.
Well, that's what's important. When people say, oh, those liberals, they're all a bunch of judicial activists, they make stuff up all the time. Well, where did corporate personhood come from? Where did money as speech come from? The conservatives made that up.
Well, the story of corporate personhood is that there was the Supreme Court clerk's job was to summarize the decisions of the justices after a term.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, this clerk was a former president of a railroad.
Mm-hmm.
An unusual job transition.
Yeah, the idea originally was that the question was, if you needed to serve a corporation, did they have 14th Amendment rights in terms of, the right to have a hearing and those kind of things? And so the decision said, well, yeah, for those kind of purposes, a corporation is a person, when it comes to what rights they have in terms of service. And then that got taken to the extreme, so that now they're saying a corporation can have religion, which doesn't make a damn bit of sense. When we get the Holly Lobby cases and things like that.
And you talk about compromises in the Constitution. I mean, the Constitution, give a little history of how the Constitution came into being.
Originally, we had what was called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation they created a confederacy, like the southern states had a confederacy in the early days of our Constitution, or early days of our government. And each state was more powerful than the federal government. And after like 10 years, we said, this isn't going to work. So they got a bunch of politicians together and said, okay, we need to fix the Articles of Confederation. And these politicians said, no, we just got to throw it out and start all over again. And we created the Constitution. It was sort of done secretly behind the scenes because they knew that if the states found out that's what they were doing, they would have called them back. So they wrote the Constitution, and it's all a bunch of compromises because they had to argue back and forth. And one of the compromises, for instance, is the Bill of Rights, because originally the Constitution was sent to the states and said, here's our Constitution, here's how the government's going to be set up. And the states rightly said, well, where's the protections for the people? Where's the right to freedom of speech? Those kind of things. And that's why they came up with the amendments. Originally, they were like 20, and then they knocked it down to 12. And then out of those 12, 10 of them got passed. So even that was a compromise. Not everything gets passed after all.
What were the two that weren't passed?
One had to do with, one of them that I'm going to say didn't get passed, and I'm glad it didn't get passed, set the number of people in the House of Representatives at a certain number. It's good that didn't get passed because no one realized how huge the United States was going to get. We'd have a Congress of, thousands and thousands of people right now if that was the case. So that one didn't get passed. Good. The other one had to do with saying that Congress could not give itself a raise during its own term. Now, here's the funny story about that one. It didn't get passed. Not enough states passed it, but there was no deadline on it. And some college student found that out, went around and got the last few states to vote on it. So that is now our 27th Amendment passed 200 years later.
Okay, so you break this into a collection of chapters. And so what about Congress's power? What can you tell us about that?
Congress's power has gotten lesser over the years, mostly because the president's power has gotten stronger. But a lot of it is, I want to make sure everyone understands that the president has power when Congress allows the president to have power. For instance, Congress decides where money is spent. For instance, if Congress says, I'm going to send money, to Ukraine, for instance, the president doesn't have the right to say no. But if the president does say no and says, I'm not going to send money to Ukraine for whatever reason, he can get away with it as long as Congress doesn't stop them. One of the problems is that the Constitution is written so that there are checks and balances. So no part of the government gets too powerful. The Congress doesn't get too powerful, the Supreme Court, the president doesn't get too powerful, but it only works if the politicians check and balance each other. And one of the problems we have currently in America is that Congress is not checking and balancing, or I should say the Senate is not checking and balancing the president like they're supposed to. So the president has much too much power right now.
The Senate was a mistake. Creating the Senate was a mistake, and we'll never be able to get rid of it. Right?
Exactly. And I talk about why that'd be great. In one section, I talk about amendments I'd love to see, and one of them is getting rid of the Senate, or else changing the Senate so that there are 100 senators and we divide the country up 100 ways like we do with the House, so that the Senate is representative. The Senate originally was appointed by the states, which is that got changed with an amendment back in the 1920s.
And that was because the founders didn't trust the people.
Well, remember, this was a big experiment. There was no other country in the world that was doing what we were doing. We had nothing to go by, and we made a lot of mistakes, like the Electoral College. Democracies that came after us learned from our mistakes, and they didn't do all the stupid things we've done.
And actually, the fact is that the U.S. Constitution inspired governments until the 60s or 70s.
Yes.
And it doesn't anymore. It is no longer the model or example that is used by nations that are creating new constitutions. They use other smarter, more contemporary ones that have fixed the problems that our archaic constitution was.
Right. Like having a parliamentary system, actually, I like a lot better, where the president or the prime minister is the head of the party, which would make Nancy Pelosi our prime minister right now, for instance. That way you have somebody in charge who knows how to get things done and can accomplish things, and is a leader of the party that's got the most people in power, so things can get accomplished. But that would require a complete rewriting of the Constitution if we wanted to do something like that. Yeah. And that's not going to happen. We can't even get rid of the Electoral College,
Yeah, and now that was another compromise.
Yes, absolutely. The once more, the founders were afraid of stupid, the common man having too much power. Let's face it. The people who wrote the Constitution were rich white men, which in some ways is not that much different than today. But they didn't like the idea of all these other people having power. And so the Electoral College was one way to prevent, mob democracy, so to speak. Of course, by the 1820s, we had already elected president, and, Andrew Jackson got elected, which I'm sure the founders would not have liked at all.
Okay. So let's move along now. Presidential power.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that.
Well, the president's power has gotten much, much too strong, as we've said, but a lot of it has to do with, how can I say this? If they let him get away with it. In this chapter about presidential power, I also talk about impeachment, and this was written a couple of years ago when I first started writing about impeachments, and I talk about Bill Clinton's impeachment and how that was a farce. But I think that's important to discuss as well. So mostly that chapter is not as much argumentative as much, here's how it works, in case you ever need to talk about it with someone.
Okay, so you say under the part on impeachment, the last part of Article 2 says, the president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Mm-hmm.
Now, president, vice president, who else? Who are those other civil officers?
Anybody. The Supreme Court, you could actually impeach Congress. Anybody in the United States government can be impeached according to
So
this.
Bill Barr and Pompeo.
Correct. Yes, they could be impeached, but we got to get Congress to be willing to do that, and that doesn't happen too often.
Well, they sure deserve it.
Yeah, I agree. But once more, like I said, if you have a Congress that just doesn't do its job, this is what's going to happen.
And again, people are arguing that impeachment is a system of justice. I've been saying it's all political.
It is absolutely political, and I've been writing about that on Facebook recently, in my post, because whether someone gets impeached or not it's not like a trial. I mean, they call it a trial, but it's really not. There's no cross-examination. It's not, are you guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? It's, are we going to remove this guy? And the House decides whether they're going to impeach him, and the Senate decides whether he's removed. It's completely a political action, which is why I expect the House to impeach Trump, and I expect the Senate not to remove him.
And what my latest article is that if the House moves the impeachment to the Senate, then they're committing suicide.
I don't know about that. That's the interesting thing. And we could argue about that backwards and forwards, because sometimes you have to do what's right, even if it's suicide.
No, I just don't think they need to hurry. I mean, it was the Nixon impeachment went on for at least 8 months.
That I agree with.
Only added a month now. Why would they do it for such a short time when they haven't even looked at any of the Mueller charges? They haven't looked at emoluments problems. They haven't looked at
And there's a lot of people they've subpoenaed that have refused to come forward. They should be forcing to come in and testify as well.
Exactly. They should have Trump. I mean, do they have the right to have Trump testify?
Boy, that's an interesting question. I think they do. I don't think the president is above any law. But as you know, the courts have sort of said that, he can't be sued while he's in office.
Have the court said it, or did Bill Barr say it?
Bill Barr. Mueller said that the president cannot be arrested while he's in office.
Based on the Justice Department's decision.
Exactly. There's no court order that says that. Although there have been lawsuits in the past against certain presidents, civil cases, that the courts have said you have to wait until he's finished to take care of this. But that's civil. That's really nothing to do with
that's
this.
That's
exactly.
an impeachment hearing.
Exactly. I agree with you completely.
Got it.
And I think politically, yes, they should try to drag this out. I hate to say drag it out, but they need to go into more detail, and get into this. And if it gets pushed off till November, that's fine.
That's exactly what I wrote.
Yeah. Okay. There we go. We're in agreement on that then.
So the next chapter is about judicial review.
Right. And that's something I think is interesting, because there nowhere in this Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court gets to decide whether laws are unconstitutional or not. They created that, but no one really challenges that. I mean, someone's got to do it, right? So they sort of made up their own power, in a sense, by saying they have the power to review laws and decide what they should be.
This is the Supreme Court becoming ultra supreme.
Yeah, but they kind of need to be. Somebody's got to decide whether a law is constitutional or not. So it makes absolute sense. I'm not, but my point being that if you're a constitutional fundamentalist, you should be saying, oh, they can't do that because it's not in the Constitution.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But, sometimes you need to read things into that kind of stuff.
So is it possible to get rid of the Electoral College?
Not without an amendment. There are ways around it. There's the Wyoming plan, which helps, but it's not exactly a solution. The Wyoming plan is that you use Wyoming, which is the smallest district, as a basis. It would mean increasing the size of the House so that every district has to have at least as many as the smallest district, which is Wyoming. That will give, California and Texas and a couple other states, including Pennsylvania, some more House members, which means that the Electoral College will be a little bit more representative. But it doesn't solve the problem of the Electoral College, which is that, we're instead of the president being elected by the people, the president is elected by property, basically.
And you're saying that Wisconsin gets 5.5 times the representation of California?
Basically, if you count the senators as well, because what happens is Wisconsin is a very small state, and they have 2 senators. Not Wisconsin. I'm sorry, Wyoming. Wyoming is the smallest state population-wise. There's more people in Washington, D.C. than there is in Wyoming. And so what happens is, because they have a small population, they get one representative, and then they get two senators. And when you add that representation up together, that means that they're representing much, much smaller people than California. You know, one senator in California represents many, 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 millions of people, whereas somebody in Wyoming, a senator in Wyoming represents like a Brooklyn neighborhood. You know, it's very small. So that's kind of unfair. Take, for example, the last Supreme Court justice we had. Kavanaugh came in, and if you took all the states that voted no on Kavanaugh, and you took that they represented the people, that means most people didn't approve of him. But all these small states approved him, so he got in to be a senator. I mean, he got in to be a Supreme Court justice, even though the majority of the people, by their representatives, didn't want him in there. And that's because we have the Electoral College.
But it's not just the Electoral
No,
College.
that's the Senate. The Senate, yes, I'm sorry.
And the Senate is a huge affront to democracy, really.
Mm-hmm.
And what it is, it's probably an unremovable, like an appendix. Like it's something that we really shouldn't have, and that is destructive, because it basically lets 20 or 30% of the people in the United States have control, which is what it is right now.
Well, that's because when we first started out, we really were the United States. We were very independent. We were almost like Europe is with the European Union. Each state had very, very different ways of doing things, and we didn't see ourselves as a big country as much as a collection of states. So it kind of made sense then. The problem is we're being tied to something that doesn't exist anymore, and that's part of the problem of the Constitution. There's no way we should be letting people from 240 years ago decide how we run our government today, but we're stuck. You know, it's going to be hard to get rid of it. The Constitution specifically says you can't get rid of the Senate. It's ironic. Yeah, there's a provision in there that says the Senate can't be abolished. So, right. So we'd have to rewrite the Constitution to allow that.
Wow. Okay, so we need to take a brief break now, a little pause for the radio show.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you list 5 reasons to get rid of the Electoral College. Why don't you throw them at us?
Sure. First, it'll make every vote count, and I think that's important. Right now, if you're a Republican in Massachusetts or you're a Democrat in Idaho, your vote really, really doesn't count. And that's bad, because you want to feel like you're participating in our government. So obviously, we want to get rid of the Electoral College so everyone's vote matters.
So you're talking about replacing it with a popular vote?
Absolutely. Number 2, it'll force candidates to campaign everywhere. And that's kind of important too, because right now, there's like a bunch of swing states that the candidates go to, and then they ignore everybody else. And the problem with that, of course, is that doesn't help democracy at all anyway. Right? If you do that, candidates will have a reason to go to your state in the middle of nowhere, because, every vote will count. Right now, a red vote in a blue state is kind of meaningless. Why do you need to even go there? And there are red votes in every blue state, and there are blue votes in every red state. The cities in Texas vote blue, for instance, but the candidates never go there. The Democrats never go there because they know they're going to lose Texas, although that might be changing.
So who opposes switching to a popular vote, and who wants to keep the Electoral College?
Well, as we've seen, the Electoral College works in the Republicans' favor, and Republicans will do whatever they can to win except get the most votes. They'll.
So when you say it works in their favor, we're talking about Bush losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College, and Trump losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College.
Right, but there have been political scientists who've been saying we need to get rid of this long before any of that happened, of course. But it works in their favor, so there's no reason for them to want to try to get rid of it. Because even though they're the minority, and the majority of people vote against them, they get into office and they get to do whatever they want. So that is one of the reasons why people don't want to get rid of it. And the small states like it, because that gives them more power than they should have, which is also not very democratic at all.
And your 5th reason is it'll make clear that the president represents the people, not the states.
Absolutely. I think that's important right now, because it's the idea that we can get rid of the red states and blue states idea, I think, is what help unite in America better than anything else.
Okay. So how do we do it?
It's going to take a constitutional amendment, and that's not going to happen anytime soon because you're going to need enough of the states to vote for it. All these small states are going to be against it.
So, but there are ways that people are trying to approximate that, right? How do they
Right.
do that?
For example, in Maine, what they do is they split it up by district. So, in other words, if you win a congressional district, then you'll get at least one of the electoral votes from that state. So they divide it up. Nebraska does this as well. So they divide it up, which means that you can at least break it up. But that's only going to work if every state does it, really, because otherwise it won't. If all the liberal states do it and all the conservative states don't, then it's going to backfire on us.
That's right. I'm thinking if California did it, it would, which right now is solidly liberal.
Right.
If they did it, they would start helping the Republicans.
Right. So it really has to be done by everybody if you really want to do it, and that's the problem. One of the problems with doing it, the advantage, Nebraska by doing it this way helped us, because Nebraska is mostly a red state, but we were able to get one electoral vote, last time from Nebraska out of it. But if the liberal states do it and the conservative states don't, all that's going to do is make it worse for us, obviously. Because we need everyone to do it. And the Wyoming plan is the other thing I mentioned that would help. It wouldn't solve the electoral college, but it'll give more representation to those states that deserve more representation that are being screwed right now.
And the next chapter is about fight for your right to parties.
Well, I wanted to put a chapter in there to talk about parties because there's no mention of parties anywhere in the Constitution. Yet, of course, even as we were getting started, parties got formed. They were the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, as they called themselves, fighting about whether we should, adopt the Constitution. So parties are around. And also I wanted to write about the stupid argument that I hear from conservatives when they don't understand that parties change. When they say, oh, yeah, well, you Democrats were the party of slavery. Yeah, 150 years ago, maybe, but that's different. And you Democrats were the ones, more Republicans voted for the Civil Rights Act than Democrats. Well, yeah, back in those days, there were liberal Republicans and there were conservative Democrats. Now all the liberals are on one side and all the conservatives are on the other side. So stop using what happened 50 years ago as an argument. So I do talk about that a bit as well.
The other side of parties is that we're stuck with this duopoly, and a lot of people think there's not much different. They're both corporate parties. They're both, they're either neoliberal or neocon. And it's usually you got to pick the lesser of two evils. Well, and the new thing that's happening in San Francisco, and I think Maine, and I think it just was passed in New York, ranked choice voting.
Right. When I lived in Boston, Cambridge had it way back in the 80s. So, it's been around for a while. And the idea about ranked choice voting is that, of course, you pick the candidate and it doesn't matter which party they're from. And so that's what will break apart the parties in some ways. But we have a winner take all system, and that's why they're parties. Because, if only one person can win, then all these little groups need to get together and cooperate in order to get one candidate gone. In other countries where they don't have a winner take all, you get 5 or 6 different parties, of course, because even if you only don't get 50% of the vote, you might still get elected to go and at least be represented, and I actually don't necessarily like that idea. I don't think that someone who gets 5% should necessarily be able to get into Congress and say something.
Well, ranked choice voting is different. Ranked choice voting,
ranked choice is different. I agree.
You pick your second choice and your third choice, and if your first choice doesn't make it into the top list round the first time, they're dropped, and then your second choice, your vote goes to the second choice, and that one can determine things. And
that's how they
until somebody gets 50% plus one.
That's how the Oscars do it, believe it or not. So, and other states, other countries do it, and now more and more cities are doing it, and we'll see if that catches on. I think that's a good idea. That's not the same thing as what I was talking about. No, I agree.
Yeah, you're talking about parliaments. And
yes, exactly.
Kind of like what they have in Israel, where they can't, at this time, decide on who will be in charge.
Yeah.
Even with Netanyahu being charged.
Yeah, well, Netanyahu and Trump apparently are good friends, and that's what happens.
Yeah, and Netanyahu is using the same defense. As Trump, same arguments. So then we go into the amendments. What do you have to say about the amendments?
Oh, well, I go through each one separately first and explain where it came from so you understand why it happened. And then we start talking more in detail, mostly about the 14th, because that's probably the most important one. Um, uh, but there's a listing, and it's good to know what they are. There's 27 of them. People should know them. The criminal defense ones are pretty darn important. The fifth, fourth through seventh, and actually the eighth too. And too many conservatives will say they're against big government, but yet they are more than happy to let the police run over everybody's rights. So that's another example of big government that I think we should fight against.
And and they love the military too.
Mm-hmm.
Of course,
Which
the
is
Democrats
ironic.
love the military too.
I don't understand the argument. These people who will get a lot of guns because they want to fight against this terrible government, and at the same time they're giving all this money to the military at the same time. It's like, well, pick a side. You realize that if you were to fight against the government, it'd be the military you'd be fighting against. There's a huge chapter on the Second Amendment, because I think that needs a lot of attention, and I argue why it should be abolished.
Okay, so talk about the second, then we'll talk about the 14th, which you said was very important.
Well, the second, I think it's important to understand where the second came from, and I talk about the history of the Second Amendment. A lot of it came from the southern states, who were afraid, just like with slavery, that if the government had the right to take their guns away, then that would stop them from stopping the slaves from escaping. They needed their guns for their militia, their state militia, a lot of whom the whole purpose was to stop the slaves from escaping and to hold the slaves down. So the southern states pushed for the Second Amendment. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't have passed anyway, but that certainly was a major push. And that's why the Second Amendment specifically says states in it. No other amendment says that, because they wanted to make sure that the federal government didn't take the states' rights to have guns away. But we also want to talk about the fact that no other country has any other amendments similar to that. I mean, it's the only amendment in the Constitution having to do with property, with something you own. I mean, there's no amendment that says you have the right to a toaster, but there's an amendment that says you have the right to a gun. We talk about why the reason is in there and what it's for, and how in the early days of the military, everyone was technically in the military. So when the government called you up, you took your gun, you took your boots, you went out and you fought, and how that doesn't apply anymore either. So it's an old amendment that applied to a time that no longer exists, that we don't need, and it's made us one of the most dangerous countries in the world because of these guns everywhere.
So what do we do about it?
Boy, there's 100 different people who've made 100 different suggestions. We've got to realize that the Second Amendment, even though it says certain things, does not prevent the government from having gun control. And even the Supreme Court has said that. The Supreme Court said you can't ban guns completely, and the Supreme Court said that it's a personal right, which is something the conservative Supreme Court decided a few years ago in the Heller decision. But at the same time, we should be able to do something about it and have some sort of control, but we're not going to happen as long as the NRA has so much power in Congress. I mean, it's a political issue more than it's a legal issue, really. Okay. Which is basically the theme of the book. It's all politics.
It's all politics,
yeah.
And what about the 14th Amendment? You said that's one of the most important ones.
That came after the Civil War, was the 14th Amendment, and that has a couple of important parts having to do with due process and equal protection. Mostly I want to talk, the equal protection is the important part. That's the part that says you can't discriminate. Now, that's been expanded over the years, of course. The original amendment talked about, didn't include women in it, for instance. There is a proposal to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, as you might be aware. That's been pushing for a long time.
Yeah,
it only needs
many days. Yeah. 30 years.
When I was in college, I worked on that, and that was in the 70s. But a couple of states might pass it, and then maybe that'll be an amendment. But the point is, the Supreme Court has actually come out and said, well, the 14th Amendment says you can't discriminate against any person, and women are people, therefore you can't discriminate against them. But they found exceptions. Women don't have to fill out the draft forms, for instance, things like that. If the Equal Rights Amendment is passed, that will change. And a different court could come along tomorrow and say, well, no, this doesn't include women, so that's why it's important to have that in there. Of course, it also doesn't include gay people or transgender people or anything like that yet, but they're people, so hopefully the Supreme Court will come down and one day accept them as well. It's also important to talk about, because when people talk about immigrants, and they say, well, these immigrants, we should just lock them up and throw them away and not give them a trial, but they're people. And the 14th Amendment doesn't say citizens, it says people. So if you're just visiting here, even if you're a tourist, you get all the rights that everyone else gets. You know, they can't just lock you up. They have to give you a trial. They have to give you a hearing. They have to give you an attorney, all those sorts of things.
So then how is it possible that these children are being put in cages?
They're getting hearings, but they're sham hearings. What the government has done is the government has said that these hearings are, they don't get an attorney. So you got this 3-year-old kid who doesn't have an attorney, who doesn't understand what's going on. And they're not regular trials. They are, how can I say it, civil trials run by the Justice Department. They're not run by real judges. And so they're shams. And that's the scary part. You know, you would think that the Constitution would protect these people, and it certainly reads like it should. But once more, if politicians get away with it and no one stops them, they get away with it.
So I'm looking at the most recent amendment is the term limits amendment.
No.
I missed it. No, the 22nd is term limits. That was 1951.
Yes. Yeah, that was it. The 27th. We have 27 of them now. The most recent one is the one about the raises. Yeah, that one came after Franklin Roosevelt. You know, obviously.
They went way short. They should have made term limits for Supreme Court justices and all judges and members of Congress too.
I actually argue that at the end of that chapter, I talk about the amendments I'd love to see, and one of them is term limits. I think, you know, Congress should be, you know, 6 terms, that is 12 years, and then Senate could be 2 terms, 12 years, and that's good enough. You know, treat this like a service as opposed to a full-time job. And then I think a good idea would be for the Supreme Court to have like 20-year terms, but it's staggered in such a way that each president gets 2 appointments. You know, if you do it right, you could do that. And that way you don't have these arguments about, you know, like when the Republicans didn't approve Obama's appointed.
Right. Yeah. And the poll tax. Talk about the poll tax.
Well, that's sort of coming back sometimes, isn't it? You know, the poll tax, the idea was when the bigots realized that they couldn't stop black people from voting, they tried every trick they can. And, you know, they still are, let's face it, you know, shutting down polling precincts in black communities, things like that. And so what they did is they came up with a tax that poor people couldn't pay because it's a lot of money. And the only way you can change that, you know, people challenged it. And pretty much their defense was, well, it doesn't say I can't do it. So we had to write an amendment that says, no, you can't. You can't stop people with a poll tax. They are always trying to find new ways around that. For instance, in some southern states right now, they're saying that, you know, you can't vote until you get an ID, and the ID costs $50, and, you know, that's a poll tax. Come on, that's the same thing. And so people are challenging it now, you know. But the whole history of America has been the people in power doing their best to make sure that the rest of us don't get any power, and that's constant, and that's been going on from the beginning of our government.
Are there any amendments to prevent that?
Well, the poll tax amendment, if you were to say, no, this is a poll tax, I think that would stop it. It is being challenged right now just about everywhere.
Any other amendments that did that?
Oh, not that I can think of off the top of my head, although if you gave me some time, I might be able to think of something. The bottom line is, no matter what you do, there's going to be a group of people, and it's almost always Republicans, who are going to do their best to try to fix the voting so that less people vote, because the more people vote, the more the Democrats win. So they're going to do everything they can to stop early voting and mail-in voting, and they're going to do everything they can to shut down precincts and wipe voting records and do everything they can to make it hard to register, when instead it should be once you turn 18, you're automatically registered. Why not? What's wrong with that? They know where you are. They know where you live. They have your ID. You know, they have your license. They know when you pay your taxes. The government knows. I don't know why we need to pre-register people.
So you've got some interesting ideas on getting rid of the Electoral College, abolish the requirement to be a natural-born citizen to be president, redraw congressional districts every 10 years through an independent commission.
So there's no more gerrymandering. Yeah.
Oh, that's a horrible problem, gerrymandering. It's
absolutely
that's not against the Constitution.
No, it isn't, and that's been around since the 1800s. You know, they're in the early days. And the problem is Democrats do it too. In Maryland recently, there was a lawsuit and the Democrats lost when they tried to gerrymander. So it's not like both parties do it. And if a conservatives come to you and say, both parties do it, you go, yes, you're right. So we need to fix it. I agree.
And then you say abolish Washington, D.C. and make Washington part of Maryland. So really you wouldn't be abolishing it. You would be remaking it part of Maryland.
Well, basically the problem is Washington doesn't have a representative. Excuse me. A voting.
It has, what is it, Eleanor Holmes Norton?
Yeah, but she's not a voting member, and they don't have any senators. And there's more people living in Washington than there are in like 5 other states, Wyoming and other small states. And that doesn't make any sense. Once more, when the people who wrote the Constitution, they didn't think about that, and this is something that needs to be changed, but it requires you to change the Constitution. So one way is to make Washington, D.C. into a state. That is going to be objected to by Republicans in the same way they object to making Puerto Rico a state, because they know it'll give you 2 minority members who are liberals. And so the conservatives are going to be against making Washington, D.C. a state. They might be convinced to just make it part of Maryland. So that way there are no new senators added.
And that people in Maryland probably wouldn't like that.
I don't know. Yeah, probably not. They might, on the other hand, it'll give them some more representation because there'll be more representatives. They won't get any more extra senators though. But I'm not sure how much of Maryland.
A couple extra members for the House then.
Yes, exactly.
Interesting. And then you say repeal the Second Amendment. Is that ever going to happen?
I don't think it's ever going to happen politically. No, this is my wish list.
And then define people to exclude corporations. Boy, I'd love to see that one. That is an abomination. That should be a bipartisan thing. That should be something that evangelicals and fundamentalist religion people should get behind.
You would think, but I don't know. Every time I think, I can't put my mind into what a lot of these evangelicals think. When Perry comes out and says that, God chose Trump to be president, and these people believe it. It's like, what is going on in their mind? This book will not change any of their minds, because nothing will.
Yeah, I'm working on going to be having on soon the author of a book on the cult of Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It is.
Absolutely. It is.
Now, what about free speech? What do you have to say about free speech?
Well, one of the problems with free speech is people don't always.
Let's take a brief break and then we'll talk about free speech.
Okay.
My guest for this show is Michael Ventrella. He's an appellate and criminal defense attorney who has taught constitutional law at a number of colleges in the Philly and Boston area, and he has written a book, How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative. So, freedom of speech.
A lot of people don't understand freedom of speech, both liberals and conservatives, because people will say something and then someone will shut them up and they'll go, you're violating my freedom of speech. Well, that's not true. If Facebook says that you're not going to be able to post sometime, that's not violating your freedom of speech. Freedom of speech has to do with the government, not individuals. People also don't understand that freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from the consequences of your speech. So if you say something terrible and you lose your job, no one's violated your freedom of speech. You don't have a right to a job. You don't have a right to say these things. You have the right to say these things. You don't have a right to complain about the consequences of after you're saying it. So I talk about that a lot. And there are a lot of, honestly, there are liberals who don't understand this as well.
Oh, I know all about them because
yeah.
As the publisher of op-ed news,
Mm-hmm.
I get people. We publish about 500 articles a month, and we reject articles, and people will say, "Oh, you're censoring me."
No, that's editing. That's not the same thing.
Right, exactly.
Yes, exactly. You don't have the right. You don't have a right to a platform. If a newspaper doesn't publish your article, you don't have the right to have that article published. If you have a TV show and you say things that the owner of the TV show doesn't like, you don't have the right to have your TV show on. They can cancel your TV show. This is different from government punishing you for your speech. That's what the Constitution prohibits, and that's what we need to understand.
And the government is not allowed to stop people from saying things.
Correct. It tries, but it's not allowed to. It's not allowed to pre-censor you, basically, is what's going on. They have to there's exceptions to the First Amendment, and I go into all the different exceptions, obviously, time, place, and manner, clear and present danger, all those sorts of things, national security. But yeah, they're not allowed to pre-censor you, which is one of the big cases. The Pentagon Papers case was one of the major ones in that particular instance, for instance.
There's a long list of exceptions, actually.
There is, and that's what's funny when people say, oh, you've got to read the Constitution, you can't interpret it. Well, the Constitution says freedom of speech. Well, does that mean you can give up and give a speech and start a riot? Does that mean you can commit slander and libel? Does that mean that you can give away troop movements? The Constitution doesn't say, which means we have to interpret it. Almost every single one of these exceptions were understood by, lawyers and the founding fathers. They kind of existed before the Constitution even. So when everyone says, oh, you can't read anything in the Constitution, that's just BS. You have to read something in the Constitution. The Constitution is just the outline. It's the guidelines. It's not the law itself.
Then there's religion.
Oh, boy. Yeah, freedom
of, and your chapter title is Freedom of and from Religion.
And that's something people don't understand either, because the First Amendment says there's an establishment clause, which says that the government will not establish a religion, which means they can't help a religion. And this is why, for instance, if a Christian puts up the 10 Commandments on public land, the Satanists have the right to put up their monument right next to it, because the government can't take sides when it comes to religion. That's in the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. And then there's the Free Exercise Clause. The Free Exercise Clause means the government will not stop you from practicing your religion. They will not prohibit you from your religion as long as it doesn't violate other laws. In other words, you can't have a religion that has polygamy, for instance, because there's laws about that. Or you can't have a religion that allows you to take drugs. You can't say, oh, my religion allows me to do this. My religion allows me to have human sacrifice. No.
Yet, there are some places that will say that people can't wear an Islamic covering. Women can't wear the hood.
Well, that's not in America.
Like on a beach or something.
Well, there are places in Europe that have those laws, but they don't have a First Amendment. That would never stand in America, or at least it should not stand in America. Okay. But I certainly have seen that's an issue in France, for instance, where they try to prohibit this stuff. They don't have a First Amendment in France, so they don't have as many rights as we do in that sense.
Inspired by Isaac Asimov's 3 Laws of Robotics, I came up with some rules of religion, and the first one is that in order for a religion to deserve respect, it has to respect other religions.
I like that one.
And if you're not a member of a religion, then that religion has no right to demand you follow its rules. But if you are a member, then it does.
Well, this is one of the things I talk about in this chapter as well, because the most fight that we have, it's always against Christians. I'm not trying to single them out, but if Muslims were trying to take away our rights, we'd be fighting against the Muslims too, but they aren't. But Christians are always trying to create fights and trying to force us to have their prayers in school, or tell us that we can't have abortions because it violates their laws, or we can't have gay marriage because it violates their laws, and they're trying to force us to live by their laws.
Or contraceptives.
Yes, contraceptives even. And that's been going on for years. So when we're fighting, it's always in defense. When people say, oh, there's a war against Christians, no, it's a defensive war. If you left us alone and didn't try to tell us to follow your rules, we would not be fighting. We'd have nothing to fight about. So it's always a defense. No one's trying to stop Christians from practicing their religion however they want. We're only trying to stop them from telling us we have to live by their religious laws.
And you have a section in that chapter on why America is not a Christian nation.
Yeah, that's an argument they give all the time, where they talk about how America was founded as a Christian nation, and there's nothing in any writing of the founding fathers to say that. In fact, there's plenty of writings to say that it was not. There's no mention of God or Jesus or religion in the Constitution, other than telling us that we can't, the First Amendment, there's a part in the Constitution that says you will not ever be forced to say a religious pledge in order to be in our government. There are things basically that make it clear that no, the idea was to keep government and religion as separate as possible. the wall between church and state, as Thomas Jefferson said. So when people say this was founded as a Christian nation, there's just no evidence to support that, and plenty of evidence to counter it. So I definitely wanted to talk about that as well.
And then you have another section, my God demands that I discriminate.
Yeah, basically, this is the section. This goes back to what I was saying about when people think that their rights are being violated when we tell them they have to abide by our laws. And we're talking about things like the stupid cake cases where, people refuse to make cakes for gay couples and stuff like that. Or the woman in, I guess it was Iowa, who refused to marry gay couples, even though the law said she had to. Her Bible said that she had the right to discriminate, and she can believe that all she wants. But if she's got a job where she's supposed to not discriminate, then she should quit that job or be fired. She doesn't have the right to that job. And that's part of the thing that that's when I get most upset with, when religious people say, well, gay marriage is wrong. Well, then don't get gay married in your church. Just don't tell everybody else they have to live by your religious rules.
I'm curious, have you as an attorney represented anybody in dealing with any of these issues?
And the criminal ones, of course, things like whether the police stopped someone properly or whether they searched them like they should have been searched and whether they violated the Constitution. I actually have an appeal pending in the Pennsylvania Superior Court right now having to do with the marijuana laws and the DUI laws here in Pennsylvania right now, where I have a client who had smoked marijuana days earlier. And under our current DUI laws, they say that if you have any amount of marijuana in your system, then you are guilty of driving under the influence, even though his marijuana was inactive and that even the doctor said it had no effect whatsoever on him. So I'm challenging that as a constitutional issue and saying that his constitutional rights are being violated because he's being punishing for something that he didn't do anything wrong. But generally speaking, no. And I'll say one thing about, at least in the area that I'm in Pennsylvania, I haven't had any problems with gay rights at all. I mean, maybe it's just because I have a district attorney who doesn't do anything about it, which is good, in the sense that I've had gay couples who had child support issues and other issues, and no one's ever treated them any different than anyone else. So that's very nice, actually. I haven't had a need to, I guess I'm saying, challenge anything like that.
Okay. You talk about treason as patriotism.
I didn't say treason is patriotism. I'm challenging those who think treason is patriotism. And what I'm referring to are those kind of people who say that I'm a patriot because I'm going to pull up arms and fight against the government if they don't do what I want. Like the militia guys out west who, pull up guns when the police come to them and say, I'm a patriot because I'm fighting against over government, and that's not how you solve.
They're terrorists.
Yeah, basically they're terrorists, and they think they're being patriots, and they are the exact opposite of patriots. And I call them, they're committing treason, basically. And the people who mask treason as patriotism, I take issue with in that part of the book.
All right, and then you get into searches and seizures.
Mm-hmm. That's something that obviously I do a lot of in my criminal practice, and I wanted to talk in that section about people and what rights you have if the police were to stop you and start searching you and looking through your car and looking through your home and those sorts of things. That happens a lot. And I got to tell you, I get a lot of cases where the police just randomly pull over cars, usually with Hispanic or black men in them, and then search the cars for no apparent reason, and I'm always having to fight that kind of stuff.
Do you win?
Yeah. Sometimes. Depends on which judge I get, depends on what kind of jury I get. The problem with the law is it's always a gamble. You never know if you're going to win or not, so you make deals whenever you can.
Okay. The exclusionary rule?
The exclusionary rule is the one that says that if the police violate your rights, they can't use the evidence. So if they break into your house and they find evidence in there and they weren't supposed to be in your house because they didn't have a warrant, the evidence is excluded. And this, once more, is also not in the Constitution, but obviously it makes sense because how else do you enforce the Constitution if you don't have some sort of penalty for breaking the Constitution? So the exclusionary rule is pretty darn important, and it's one of those things that keeps the police from going too far.
And then it's taking the fifth. You got a chapter, Taking the Fifth, and you talk in there about grand juries are a sham.
Yes. Juries are where you have a defense attorney and a prosecutor, and you pick the juries and you question them and you make sure that they're unbiased, and there's a judge there, and then there's a trial that's open to the public, and you can cross-examine and you can look at the evidence, and both sides get a closing argument, and a jury is a fair system. A grand jury is none of those things, and sometimes people hear about grand juries and they get confused. A grand jury is when the DA gets a bunch of people who aren't screened in any sort of way. He presents whatever evidence he wants to present to them and says, is there enough evidence for me to charge so-and-so? And then the jury comes back, the grand jury comes back and says yes or no. And they 99.99% of the time, they do whatever the DA tells them to do, because that's what's going to happen when you only hear one side of the story and there's nobody to cross-examine and there's no judge to stop you. So there's complete shams. The whole point.
You know, I was called to be be on a grand jury, and because I'm freelance and self-employed, I was excluded. But a call to be a grand juror can last like 18 months.
Yeah, basically you show up once every month or once every 2 weeks. And, you know, it's for the big cases, the murders and the things where they want to bring stuff up. But it's also used by prosecutors who don't want to bring charges. Like, for example, in the Ferguson case, you know, the prosecutor was supposed to charge the cops. And so he had a grand jury, and he brought the grand jury, and he gave them all the evidence to make it look like the cop was innocent. And they all said, well, we're not going to bring charges. And then, of course, that allows the DA to go, oh, well, I tried to bring charges, but the grand jury said no. It's a sham.
And the other thing is, if you're sitting there every 2 weeks for 18 months with the same prosecutors, they're your buddies.
Yeah, and there's nobody to cross-examine them or question them. You know, how do you if you gave me a grand jury, I could convince all of them to do whatever I wanted to too, because I'd only present the evidence I want to, and I'd ignore all the stuff I don't want to present. The other problem with the grand juries is that they are allowed to subpoena people to testify. And quite often you don't have the right to remain silent unless you are actually the defendant yourself. But what they do is that allows them to get information before any of us defense attorneys get to see it. And then we don't even get to see the transcripts of these things. You know, it's all secret. It's not open to the public.
Well,
most other countries have gotten rid of it. The United States is the only place that has grand juries left. And most states have gotten rid of it. We still have it here in Pennsylvania.
What's the alternative?
The alternative is to have a preliminary hearing, which is what they do for the smaller cases. At a preliminary hearing, the DA presents evidence to say, Judge, we think there's enough evidence to send this to a jury. I get to cross-examine. I get to look at the evidence, and the judge decides whether there's enough to send it to a jury or not, which is pretty much the same thing a grand jury does. But this time, there's a judge, and there's cross-examination, and evidence is presented, and it's open to the public. They do that now with small cases. The big ones are the ones that they use the grand juries for, or they use the grand juries when they really don't want it to go forward and they use it as an excuse to get rid of it.
So you wrap up the book with a chapter on what it means to be a patriot.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole theme of the book in some ways, you know, and to me, being a patriot, I always hated seeing commercials for politicians that talk about America, and you see like these rural areas and a bunch of white people in, you know, in a farm and stuff. And that's America, you know, and they want to, you know, pick up trucks and flags and everything, and that's supposed to make you feel patriotic. But to me, patriotism is walking down the streets of New York City with so many different cultures and people walking by you, speaking different languages, wearing different dresses. That is what makes America great in my mind. The fact that we are accepting of lots of different people. We're not all the same. That's what's patriotic to me. And patriotic to me doesn't mean just following leaders unquestioningly and everyone being exactly alike. One of the things that makes us great is that we're not all alike. We all fight and we talk and we argue, and that's what makes America good.
All right, we need a wrap. Any words?
I just want to point out the book. I should mention Darren Bell. The artwork, I should mention, is by Darren Bell. There's cartoons all through here, and I just want to give him a heads up because he's a great guy. He's an editorial cartoonist, and as we were going to print, he won the Pulitzer Prize for editorial cartooning, so I made sure that got put on the cover. But he's a great guy. He did some great cartoons. So, you know, if you only read the book and don't look at the cartoons, you're missing half of it.
Okay, great. And my guest for this show has been Michael Ventrella. He's an appellate and criminal defense attorney, and he's written the book, How to Argue the Constitution with a Conservative. Thanks, Mike, for being on the show.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.